Okay, hi everybody, and hope you're well. And the parsha for this week is Shelach, and the Haftorah for this week has a very obvious connection to the parsha. Shelach was the decision of the Jewish people to send spies to check out the land of Canaan, and there were 12 spies, and they went for a period of 40 days, and when they returned, 10 of the 12 spies gave a very devastating report about how fearsome was the land and the inhabitants, and they would have no way of succeeding, etc. Only 2 of the spies said we have to have faith in Hashem. This was Yoshua ben Nun and Kalev ben Yefuneh. And as a result, the spies came back on the 8th day of Av. That night, which is the 9th of Av, all of the Jewish people, all of the men, actually the women did not accept the report, but the Jewish men cried and sobbed and complained, and it was therefore decreed that all of those men would die in the desert over a period of 40 years. So this was a pretty tragic statement or event, and indeed the Gemara tells us that this is why the 9th of Av became the day of destruction, because Hashem said, on that day, the night of the 9th of Av, Atem b'chisem b'chia sholchinam, thank you, Atem b'chisem b'chia sholchinam, you cried a sobbing for no reason. I will make this day a bechia l'doros, a day of eternal crying. So basically, the mission of the spies, as is described in the Torah, was a monumental, devastating, catastrophic failure. Go forward 40 years or so after the death of Moshe, we read in the time of Yoshua ben Nun, Yehoshua, who after all knew very well about the event of the spies, he was one of the spies, decides to send 2 spies to check out Jericho, which was the first city that was conquered in Eretz Israel, and that was a mission that was successful. So it's very, very interesting. The Torah's description of the Meraglim was a catastrophe. Yoshua ben Nun's shlichus of the Meraglim turned out to be quite proper. So in order to understand the relationship here, so really the relationship here is one of contrast. Kind of the same thing was done, and in one case the ending was very, very bad, and in the other case the ending was very, very good, the conquest of Jericho, the beginning of the conquest of Eretz Israel. So in order to understand the dynamics here, we have to really focus on the parsha itself, and then we'll go back to the Haftorah. First, was there a sin in the sending of the spies? In other words, putting aside what they reported and how they reported it, was it legitimate to have a mission to scout out the territory prior to their entering and prior to their making war? So there really is
How can it be if you have Joshua sending spies?
Well, this is the discussion. According to Rashi actually seems to take the position, several places in the narrative, that it's not just the report of the spies that was sinful, it is even the sending of the spies that is sinful, because if one had belief in God, that God will give them victory, why is there a need to have spies to check things out? HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised you the land, you will therefore be successful. So according to Rashi, Moshe Rabbeinu himself made a mistake. After all, Moshe Rabbeinu authorized the sending of the spies. Moshe Rabbeinu himself made a mistake in authorizing the Shiluach HaMeraglim. That's what Rashi says. Now, the Ramban says that is absolutely incorrect. Because if you're going to tell me the Shiluach of Meraglim is a contradiction to Emunah in Hashem, then how could Yehoshua send the spies later? And not only that, but later in the Chumash itself, it's only like one verse, Moshe sends 2 people on a spying mission to conquer Yazer, which is in the Golan Heights. Moshe Rabbeinu sent Meraglim after this Chet HaMeraglim. So the Ramban says it's a davar pashut that Emunah in Hashem is not inconsistent with what we call hishtadlus, human effort to try to actualize the divine blessing. After all, Hashem is the source of health and healing, but you're obligated to go to a doctor and utilize medical science. Hashem is the source of parnasa, but you have to get a job. Right? This is what they say. People always look for segulos, some type of magical thing that will get you what you need. So it's been pointed out, the best segula for parnasa is to get a job. That doesn't always work, but usually it works on one level or the other. So the Ramban says it's entirely compatible with a divine promise. Hashem says, I will give you victory, you will be successful, that you have to have a military strategy. You have to kind of look, where are the vulnerable points, where are the strong points, where is it easier to attack, where is it more difficult to attack. So the Ramban says for a davar pashut, the etzem shiluach hameraglim, the sending of the spies, was perfectly legitimate. But the problem was, the report that the spies gave was editorializing and going beyond their assigned mission. Their assigned mission was, tell us where is the best place for us to attack. Do not give us an opinion whether we will be victorious or not victorious. That's none of your affair. Hashem promised us victory. The problem was editorializing. They were supposed to report on the facts, just the facts, please. And instead they expressed opinions, and those opinions demoralized Am Yisrael, and it played on their fears, and it played on their insecurities, and that became like a cancer which spread throughout the people, resulting in this gezerah that entire generation died. This is what the Ramban says. Yeah.
In that perspective, do we have any understanding of why the people listened to their negative report? Why didn't the people just say, look, we didn't ask you for your opinion about future results.
Right.
We just asked you to tell
right.
us
I will address that. Why did it hit such a responsive note in people's hearts?
These were leaders too.
Huh?
Right? They were leaders.
Yes, and in fact they were leaders, and in fact Rashi even makes the point that Moshe deliberately chose people who were righteous. Kulam anoshim, all of them were righteous. Mm-hmm. And yet this happened. How could that happen? So let me just first,
Also the two, they didn't give a corresponding 20% notice about that. 20%.
Which was the?
Were good. Color.
Yes,
and
the two good ones.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the two good ones got 0% response.
Well,
negated them.
yeah. It wasn't
20%.
It was winner take all, right?
Yeah.
It was not the proportional representation. Yeah, that's very true. Mm-hmm. I'll try to explain that also. But first, let me go back to the more general point before we get to the actual problem. Excuse me, of how the spies reported it. And that is, Ramban's point seems to be extraordinarily powerful. That there is nothing wrong. Excuse me, there is nothing wrong in sending spies. This is legitimate hishtadlus. So in what way does Rashi mean that there was something wrong in this? What was wrong in sending meraglim? Moshe did it later, Yoshua did it later, and this is normal military procedure. So the Netziv offers the following explanation. He says, he cites a story in the book of Shmuel. If you remember, at some point, when Shaul failed to carry out his duty to eradicate Amalek, so Hashem told Shmuel, go and anoint David Hamelech, David, or a son of Ishai, to be the successor. And Shaul asked Hashem, how do I dare do this? Shaul will hear about what I'm doing, and he's going to kill me. So Hashem said, well, the way you cover yourself is bring an animal. This is before there's a temple, so you could bring korbanos everywhere, and make it look like you're only going to Beis Lechem to bring a korban, and that will cover your bases. So the Netziv raises the following question. Why didn't Hashem give him that suggestion at the beginning? In other words, Hashem told him, go. David asked God, Shmuel asked God, but how will I protect myself? And God gave him an answer. Shouldn't God have given him that protection before the question? That should have been part of the initial mission. So the Netziv says the following idea. The Netziv says that the degree of divine providence that you get from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is kind of a circular idea. The more you believe that Hashem is protecting you, the more is the reality of that protection. And the less confident you are that Hashem will take care of you, then the more He will leave you to the vagaries of nature. Emunah builds on itself. The greater the emunah, the greater the hashgacha, the providence. The lesser the emunah, the lesser the hashgacha. So every diminution in emunah becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree. And therefore the Netziv argues that had Shmuel not expressed fear or hesitation or insecurity, he wouldn't have needed to engage in some type of trick so that Shaul wouldn't kill him. He would have been protected by special divine providence. But once he's worried, once he's insecure, once the emunah in his heart is not strong enough to give him a sense of safety, then Hashem says, you are living in the world of hishtadlus, you are living in the world of human effort, you are living in the world of political strategies. Therefore, based on what you are, what would have been somewhat undesirable now becomes mandatory. You must cover your tracks. This is how the Netziv understands the story of Shmuel.
If that's a general truism, that a person who has less faith receives less, let's say, salvation or protection, then if it is in our lives and so on, then is it that God will help less, or that He continues, God consistently helps, but a person's blocking it in some way? Is there something that we can amplify?
Well, I'm not sure. This comes really from the Chovas Halevavos, so it's much, much earlier than the Netziv. And the Chovas Halevavos simply makes the point that the truth of the matter is everyone's life is connected to God in one way, but sometimes God acts through nature, and sometimes God acts through specialized divine providence. And the Chovas Halevavos says, the less emunah one has, the more they will have to struggle to connect to God's divine providence. It will not be apparent. It will be covered up. It will be masqueraded behind various veils, which means it is actually still there, but it's not there in a way that they will perceive.
Is the converse that the more one struggles, the more they should have faith?
Well, in a sense, that would be the case, but normally it works the opposite. In other words, if I struggle and I see less, that hardly is going to increase my faith in many cases. But if one has this teaching in mind, it might, and at that point the struggles might reduce themselves. Now the Netziv says this idea. Let me give you another text that he explicates with this understanding, and that is the famous question that all the commentaries ask. Again, in the book of Shmuel, when the Jewish people ask for a king, they want a king. This is shortly before Shmuel's death. So Shmuel says, no, a king is not a good idea. A king will oppress you. A king will be abusive. He will take your sons for slaves and your daughters for maidservants. He will impose taxes. Why do you want a king? Is not God your king? Is not God enough? Why are you seeking a flesh and blood king? And Shmuel even called on God to do a miracle, that there was a thunderstorm in the middle of the harvest season to show that Hashem despises the fact that you want a king. Now, the big problem is, in the book of Devarim, in Parsha Shoftim, it is one of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah that the Jewish people should appoint a king. It's a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah. So when the Jewish people are asking for a king, they're not committing a sin. They are actually doing one of the mitzvahs of the Torah. In fact, there's a whole question, why didn't they ask for a king before? So there are many, many interpretations. By the way, the only interpretation that is against this idea that there's a mitzvah to have a king is the Abarbanel. And that's very, very fascinating. The Abarbanel had extensive experience with at least Christian monarchies. The Abarbanel was the finance minister of Spain during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. This was during the Inquisition. And in 1492, when those Jews who did not convert were ordered to be expelled from Spain, tradition has it on the 9th of Av, although the historical records are not exactly in agreement on that, but that was the tradition that happened on the 9th of Av as well. So the Abarbanel was given special permission that if he wanted to, if he needed his financial acumen, he would be allowed to stay, and he could even practice Judaism. But the Abarbanel totally rejected that offer, and indeed he was at the head of the procession leaving Spain. So the Abarbanel understood that monarchies can be abused in many, many ways. And the Abarbanel spent the rest of his life, first in Portugal, and then in the city-states of Italy, Florence and Milan, and that is where he wrote a number of his commentaries. And in his commentary on this, he has a whole essay. It's very unusual to have political commentary of this nature, but he has a whole essay on the evils of monarchy and absolute power, and he praises the Italian city-states because they have representative government with term limits, so that those who are governing cannot abuse their power, because in a few years they will be subject to the people that they were ruling over. And he learns as a dat yachid, he's the only one that understands it this way, that the Torah never encouraged monarchy, the Torah simply permitted it, and som tasim alecha melech is a permission to have a king if you want it. It's a grudging permission, but it is not a desideratum, it is not something that is desirable. That is the Abarbanel. Now, the only problem is, what's interesting is, though, that even the Abarbanel, and maybe especially the Abarbanel, certainly concedes that Mashiach will be a king. And in fact, the Abarbanel was one of the most prolific writers in Jewish history on Mashiach. He wrote over and over and over again commentaries on Daniel and freestanding books on Mashiach. So it's interesting that the Abarbanel does acknowledge that at the end of days, monarchy will be it. But he did have a very healthy suspicion of monarchy. It's reminiscent, I think, of Winston Churchill's famous remark that democracy is the worst form of government ever invented, except for everything else. So, sure, there's all sorts of problems, but again, the Abarbanel is a dat yachid. All the other commentaries, and indeed Chazal in the Gemara, look at minui melech as a mitzvah. If so, how do we understand Shmuel's consternation over asking for the king? So here is what the Netziv says. The Netziv adopts the same type of approach. And that is, had the level of emunah been very, very great in the Jewish people, they would not have needed a centralized government. God would have taken care of them. You wouldn't need a structured society in that way. But once they ask, and once they express a need, that indicates that they are living on the level of insecurity, so that which was inherently undesirable now becomes necessary. So Shmuel's criticism is not that they're asking for a king, it's that they reached a level of diminution in their emunah, which compels them to ask for a king, because they are no longer secure that God will protect them without a centralized government. So that's his interpretation of Minoi Melech, and that's his interpretation of Shmuel and Shaul and the like. And then he swings back and says, that's how we can reconcile the issue of the Meraglim. Had the Dor HaMidbar been perfect in faith, they wouldn't have needed the Meraglim. But once they asked, Moshe became duty-bound to fulfill that request, and that is why we use it later, because we're no longer on that level. In other words, the Netziv's contribution here is that it's not an either-or binary question. Is it good to send Meraglim, or is it bad to send Meraglim? Rather, something would be good if the people would be on a certain level, but that very thing turns out to be bad when people are on a different level. And based on their madrega, Shiluach HaMeraglim was absolutely necessary, because they lived in the world of Hishtadlus, but it would have been better had they been on a higher madrega. And certainly, actually I'll tell you the truth, I can give you a simple distinction between Yoshua's time and Moshe's time. In Moshe's time, people were living under open miracles. There was the man coming from heaven, there was a traveling well. So at that level, why do they need Meraglim? Later, after Moshe Rabbeinu dies, there's no man, there's no be'er, there are no clouds of glory. So then you can understand there's a need to resort to more natural needs. Right. So this is the mahalech. This is the approach of the mitzvah. Yeah.
Without taking us off on a tangent, we're reminded that Shmuel was advised by Hashem to pretend that he went to Bethlehem for a sacrifice. Isn't there an issue of Hilul Hashem there when a recognized holy man engages in a flagrantly dishonest act, which will become known to be dishonest as time goes by?
Well, no. In other words, this was not a fraud. Meaning, he actually took an animal, and he did offer it as a korban. It's not that he made believe he was doing it. He did it. So,
but he didn't.
And
not the real reason for his
I understand that, but the problem was there was no lying over here because nobody bothered to ask. In other words, when Shaul saw he was doing that, so no questions were asked. So Shmuel was not even put in a position where he had to lie. So there was no lie. So he said, I didn't deny anything. I didn't confirm. I didn't deny.
I see.
Okay. All right. So now, though, I want to talk about the second part of the issue, and that is not just the sending of the Meraglim, but the way the Meraglim responded and the way the people responded to that. And first of all, if the Meraglim were righteous, how could they come back with that type of report? So here, too, we have a very, very interesting approach of the Netziv, the Malbim, Rav Hirsch, many of the commentators give us a very similar approach. And they point out that there was a fundamental distinction between the way Hashem treated Bnei Yisrael in the desert and the way they're going to be treated once they come to Eretz Yisrael. In the desert, all existence is supernatural. They get the man from Shamayim. They have a traveling well with them that gives them water. They have clouds of glory that protect them. And this, after all, was the generation that experienced the 10 Makos in Mitzrayim and Kriyas Yamsuf. So their relationship to God is open and obvious and clear, supernatural. There is no room for denial, although we had the Ched HaEgel. But basically, the hand of God is crystal clear. Now, when we come to the land of Israel, things are going to be very, very different. Of course, it is the land that God takes care of. But there's not going to be man. We're going to have to plant and plow and harvest. There's not going to be a traveling well of water. We're going to have to dig for our wells and the like. In other words, we're going to have an army. We're going to have to fight. In other words, God is no longer going to be open and obvious. We're going to have to build a society. We're going to have medical clinics and law firms and accounting offices and stores and fields and companies. And basically, what is going on is the following. And of course, worst of all, the Jewish people know that they're going to lose Moshe Rabbeinu. Let me point out this obvious point. Although the particular Aveira for which reason Moshe Rabbeinu was denied entry into the land did not yet take place, but it was already known through prophecy that Moshe will not be entering Eretz Yisrael.
Now you'll see what happens.
We know this because we read in last week's Parsha about the two prophets, Eldad and Medad, Misnavim. They were doing prophecy, and Yoshua goes to Moshe and says, arrest these people, imprison them. And Rashi says, what were Eldad and Medad saying? Moshe Meis, Yoshua Machnis. Moshe's going to die, and it's Yoshua that's going to take them to Eretz Yisrael. So this was known. This was known.
But wasn't already back in Egypt when God said, now you'll see what will happen to Pharaoh? Rashi says there that he won't see what will happen to the 7th king, the 31 kingdoms.
Yeah, but you see, but a drasha like that is really an after the fact, meaning Hashem said it in such a way, not that Moshe understood that, but that Hashem said it because Hashem knew what those words meant. It was not necessarily apparent to everybody else, but this was an explicit message. So now, put yourself in the minds of the people. They're living in the desert. I remember, if I could use a trivial example, maybe it's not appropriately reverent, but there's a similar point. You may, I don't know if any of you remember the cartoon Doonesbury. So in the, whatever it is, one of the characters in the Doonesbury cartoon was a person who didn't want to finish school. He wanted to just keep on being in school so he wouldn't have to get a job. So he got every degree that a university offered. He got an MD, and he got a JD, and he got different PhDs in many, many different fields. And he was panicking because he literally had gotten every single degree that the university offered, and he didn't know what is he going to do. He wanted to stay in school his whole life. Now, lahavdil, this is a very, very different issue. The Midbar was the great formative educational influence on the Jewish psyche, implanting in our personalities that God takes care of us, that He is our creator, He is our sustainer, and that's so obvious and undeniable. And we needed to absorb those lessons because as we transition into a new level of existence, where the hand of God is not going to be so apparent, it's going to be so easy to forget that. And that can result in two negative reactions. On one hand, it could lead to despondency and hopelessness, as we think we're just overwhelmed by the odds against us. Or the other way around. It could lead to arrogance and complacency, as we think we are masters of our fate. So the Dor HaMidbar feels we're not yet ready for the challenge of transitioning away from this life. We need more time so we and our children and our children's children will absorb emunah in Hashem for over such a prolonged period of time that when we enter Eretz Yisrael, the Hester Panim, the concealment of the divine, will not throw us off track. So really, in many ways, the fact that God decreed they will wander for 40 years, instead of looking at it as a punishment, in a sense, they got exactly what they asked for. They said, we need more time. We need to be in this school a little bit longer. And Hashem said, if that's what you need, that's what you will get, but you will not be the ones who will be entering Eretz Yisrael. So it turns out that the sin of the Meraglim and the sin of the people were believing that they were not capable of confronting an existence where God's presence would be concealed and not obvious, especially without the leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, one might say that the chait of the Dor HaMidbar was not a lack of emunah in God, in Hashem, but there was a lack of emunah in their capacity to navigate a world where the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to be as obvious and open as it was in the Dor HaMidbar. This is what the Mefarshim say was their chait. They didn't believe they could handle it at that time. They wanted more time with the hashgacha of miraculous, divine intervention to beat that idea into them so that they will see the hand of God even in milchama and in agriculture and in business and in commerce and in everything they do throughout society, not to be tainted or thrown off track with the kochi v'yotzim yadi, that it's my strength that did it, which is the nisayon of arrogance, and in the other direction, not to be thrown off with hopelessness and despondency. Now, this explains a very interesting thing. Yehoshua ben Nun's original name was Hosea. And only at the time of this Shalichus HaMeraglim did Moshe change his name slightly by adding the Yud. And it says, Vayikra Shem Hosea ben Nun Yehoshua. Moshe called it Yehoshua. And Rashi explains Yehoshua is actually a prayer, may God save you, Ka Yoshiacha Miatzas HaMeraglim. Now, Moshe apparently had an intimation that this mission would go bad. He understood that these were some of the currents that are going on, and therefore he prayed that Yoshua should not fall prey to this. Now, he didn't pray for Kalev, who's the other good spy. Why does he only pray for Yoshua?
Why didn't he pray for them all?
Well, because he knew, in other words, basically, he knew in their heart that this is what they would do. So you can't really pray to change somebody who's decided something. But he knew, for the reason I'll explain in a moment, that Yoshua did have this emunah, but he knew Yoshua was weak and vulnerable in a way that Kalev was not. Now, why is that so? The reason that's so is, if the Meraglim's argument is, we're not good enough, we're not strong enough, we're not brave enough, we're not righteous enough to be able to achieve this victory without a prolonged exposure in the Dor HaMidbar and to Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership, then who would feel that insecurity more than the designated leader who would succeed Moshe Rabbeinu? See, unlike, without saying anything about Mike Pence in particular, but unlike the typical stance of the vice president, who is kind of waiting for the president to get out of the way, one way or the other, so that the vice president could take over, the true Jewish leader is always a reluctant leader. Moshe Rabbeinu himself was an extremely reluctant leader. Moshe Rabbeinu argued, in fact, according to Chesed, he argued too much with God, not wanting the job, get somebody else, I'm not adequate, I don't deserve it, get somebody better. Because if you want to be the boss, you want to be the leader, then you're bringing in ego into it. And the true leader does what needs to be done, but does not do so for the kavod and the gedula. So as a result, Yoshua is not waiting for Moshe Rabbeinu to die so he can take over. It's the other way around. Yoshua would also like to keep Moshe Rabbeinu alive as long as they could. So Moshe understood. Now how he knew, we don't know for sure. Again, he was a Navi. Moshe understood that the direction of the Meraglim would be to prey on the insecurities of the Jewish people without Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership. So Moshe knows Kalev will be firm in his trust in Yehoshua's leadership. But Yehoshua himself might be plagued with self-doubt. And therefore Yoshua needs the chizuk. And by the way, there's kind of a textual indicator that maybe Yoshua was wavering. You know, it's very, very, very interesting. The 10 spies give their negative reports. It's a land that consumes the inhabitants. And if you look, it is Kalev who makes the big speech that you have to have faith in Hashem, and Hashem promised us. And Yeshua doesn't say anything. Now, why isn't Yoshua talking? So I think you might suggest here that Yoshua is, well, I'll give you two reasons, but based on this Mahalech, Yoshua is not talking because Yoshua himself is wavering a little here. In other words, it's only Kalev that gave Yoshua the chizuk, not to give in. Because, after all, if you're the one that's going to replace Moshe Rabbeinu, and people are talking about what type of life can we have without Moshe Rabbeinu, without the miracles of the Midbar, that's going to affect Yoshua in a very, very deep way. Now, some Mefarshim give an opposite answer. Some Mefarshim say like this, why Yoshua is so passive here. They say the opposite. If Yoshua would have been active, he would have been accused of acting for an ulterior motive. So, according to this approach, he needed to be quiet so that people would understand that Kalev's arguments were objective and they were not based on political power. So these are two opposite approaches. One is Yoshua was quiet because he was insecure. The other is he was quiet so that he should not be accused of acting out of self-interest to gain his position or whatever it is.
The first few chapters of Yoshua are filled with the phrase Chazak ve'ematz.
Chazak ve'ematz. And I think that's very, very true. I mean, we have to understand how enormously difficult it would be to succeed Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Not an easy job at all. The shoes that one is filling are shoes that are beyond anyone's ability to fill them. And indeed, Chazal describe the face of Moshe was like the sun, and the face of Yoshua was like the moon. And this is not just a difference in size, this is the very nature is different. The sun is a source of its autonomous light, and the moon can only be a reflection of the glorious light of the sun. Yoshua could reflect some of Moshe's glory. But on the other hand, it's interesting that Yoshua does have the credit of conquering the land, settling the land. He translated Moshe's directives into an actual society on the ground. And that is also a monumental achievement. In fact, Chazal actually say, if the Jewish people wouldn't have sinned, we wouldn't have needed all the other prophetic books, which are full of Musar, but we would have had the 5 books of the Chumash, and we would have had the book of Yoshua, which is how those 5 books were implemented in the building of a Jewish society.
Yoshua was a prophet. Was
He was.
Caleb a prophet?
Caleb is enumerated as a prophet as well.
Were all
Yes.
the Rabbi prophets, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. I'm not aware of any proof that they're enumerated as prophets.
And could you remind us to why Yoshua was chosen? Even Moshe, at the time of his segue away, asks God to appoint someone who was this, that, and so on. I don't remember which portion.
Yes.
What
So if you have to remember, Yoshua is actually very much involved with Moshe way before that official designator as leadership. Yoshua is described as Meshares Moshe. He was Moshe's assistant. According to Chazal, Yoshua was involved in cleaning up after Torah classes and the like, and he had a very close personal association with Moshe Rabbeinu. It is only later, in last week's Parsha, Yoshua is designated as a leader. But Chazal say from here a very famous statement, Gadol Shimusha Yoser Milimuda. That means when you personally serve or work with a great person, that's even greater than just learning Torah from them, because you actually see how to translate Torah values into everyday living. And Yoshua merited this because of his great personal devotion to Moshe Rabbeinu, and he spent all his time with him. So that is why he was chosen to be leader, precisely because of the quality of his willingness to be Meshares Moshe. He apprenticed with Moshe.
And when he took over, was there something added that God gave to him that transferred? Obviously, it wasn't Moshe, but was there something above and beyond the abilities and the connection he had before? Did something get transferred?
Well, as was pointed out, Hashem says repeatedly, Chazak v'yamatz, be strong and of good courage. So Hashem infused Yoshua with great strength of character, great determination. I'm not aware of a specific gift in that sense of Ruach HaKodesh or whatever, but Yoshua is considered to have been given prophetic inspiration. He is one of the prophets, enumerated, the 48 prophets, and the like. And of course, let me remind you, Yoshua himself did what is an enormously great miracle. However you understand it, the Rishonim have a lot of problems scientifically, and that is stopping the sun. Do you remember? In fact, there are 2 miracles Yoshua did. 2 miracles. One is he split the Yarden River when we crossed it, which is a mini Kriyas Yamsuf. And number 2, he stopped the sun, because the Jewish people were fighting a battle, and they were given extra hours of daylight to be able to wage war, whether it was another 18 hours, 24 hours, different interpretations in the Gemara. Now, the Rishonim, who already were aware of astronomy, have tremendous difficulty what exactly is the mechanism of stopping the sun, given the fact that in either case, the sun does not go around the earth goes around the sun. So the way you would stop the sun is by stopping the rotation of the earth. Well, what does that mean exactly? If you stop the rotation of the earth, things happen. You fall off, or whatever it is. So the Rishonim have a lot of problems scientifically how you describe that particular change of nature, but it is recorded that the day did not end for many, many hours. So apparently, if Yoshua was given this power to do supernatural miracles, that was something he got as a result of his leadership. Lubavitcher Rebbe used to say this, and people would talk about Lubavitcher Rebbe could do this and that, whether, again, I'm not opining on whether it was or not, but he once remarked, he says, everything a Rebbe can do comes from the Hasidim that need him and rely upon him. Meaning without the Hasidim that need and rely upon him, the Rebbe cannot do anything. And a Jewish leader is the same way. In fact, with Moshe Rabbeinu, when the Chet HaEgel, when Moshe Rabbeinu was still on Har Sinai, and Hashem says, go down, because your people have corrupted themselves. Rashi says, Lech Reid doesn't just mean physically go down. Migdulatcha, you are no longer in a position of greatness, because your greatness comes from them. And in fact, we see this with Moshe Rabbeinu's sin in a few weeks. When Moshe Rabbeinu hits the rock instead of speaking to the rock, and Moshe Rabbeinu calls them rebellious, the Rambam explains, when a Jewish leader loses his faith in his people, Hashem says, that's it. Meaning, Hashem forgave all of the sins the Jewish people did against him. But when Moshe sins against the people, Hashem says, that's it. You're one strike and you are out. And this is very, very important. A Maneg Yisrael has to have faith in his people, because then people rise to the faith that the leader has in them. Same thing with parenting, really. The faith we have in our children lifts them up. If we believe they won't amount to anything, they usually won't, because it becomes, perceptions become the reality. Same thing with spouses, husband and wife, right? What's the old saying? Behind every great man is a great woman, but some say it this way: behind every great man is a surprised woman. But okay, but it goes in both.
Mother-in-law.
Say, surprised mother-in-law. Okay, that's another version. Okay. That's good too. But but it goes both ways. I don't mean to suggest that it's the woman that is there to support the man. It also goes in the other direction as well. That a man has to have faith in what his wife is able to accomplish in whatever sphere she chooses to accomplish. And then, through that faith and through that chizuk, we become the best that we're able to become. So it's an indispensable quality of leadership. In fact, even in a secular sense, if you talk about a good business leader, I mean, this is like standard business school writing, that a good leader is one who gives people a sense of their potential and they're capable of accomplishing great things, and that's certainly a Maneg Yisrael. A Maneg Yisrael. And, so even if you take someone like Rav Kook, for example, so that's why, one of the reasons why Rav Kook, again, some people called it naivete, but he was unrelentingly optimistic. No matter what he saw, he always interpreted it in a good light. So if Jews were playing soccer on Shabbat, he said, well, it's not good, they're doing it on Shabbat, but they're building up their strength so they will build up this land. Like he tried to see everything positive, because his shita was that by accentuating the positive within people, that is the direction that they're going to move in that direction. Yeah.
Question? Without challenging the wisdom of the sages who explained for us the motives of the spies, could it not be that we're being rather unfair in attributing to them dishonest motives? Normally, when someone tells you the reason for a decision, unless there's some reasons to suspect, we accept that. And they gave a reason. They said these guys, the inhabitants of that land, are bigger and stronger than any enemies that we've ever encountered on the battlefield. We remember that we came close to losing our war against Amalek. When Moshe, if they hadn't figured a way to keep Moshe's arms up, we would, and we sustained losses. So we knew we were acquainted with warfare against adversaries of normal size.
Right.
And we know from the episode of David and Goliath that physical stature can be a great advantage in the battlefield. That's why they sent Goliath out to challenge the best that we had to offer. Isn't it possible that they were sincere? They just said, these guys are too big, we're going to lose.
Well, again, I'm not saying that the simple explanation would be implausible, but on the other hand, there are some questions with that, and that is, after all, this was a generation that saw supernatural interventions, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the Red Sea, and they have divine promises. So in a sense, why would they have the naturalistic fear of an enemy that is too powerful for them?
I'm sorry, didn't they say we were like grasshoppers in their eyes? It was more of a psychological.
Yes,
It doesn't
so,
mean
right,
that
so
they saw them as giants. They saw
Yeah,
themselves
in fact,
as
I wanted to
small.
add this thought from the Chesed Rebbe, a very famous pasuk that also goes to the notion of inner insecurities, lack of security. That famous verse where they said, and we were grasshoppers in our eyes, meaning that when we looked at them, we felt we were grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. So the Chesed Rebbe, who always has very sharp observations, says it starts off with you. If you look at yourself as a grasshopper, that's what they will see you as.
And they saw that the land was consuming the people, but really Hashem was having all these funerals with these spies.
That's right.
So
All
they
the
might
people,
have seen
all the
this.
people were dying because God wanted to decimate their enemies, and they turned that into a sign that God maybe is rejecting us or not helping us, and the like.
There's a lot of fake news out there.
Right. Right. Yeah.
We have the spying in the time of Yosef and his brothers. I guess it comes from the Midrash there.
Yes.
Maybe it's not specifically what the kingdom. We have this episode, these episodes.
Yeah.
Is there another in Tanakh? Is there another, or even in Midrash related to not another major episode of spying? Obviously, spying took place all the time. But is there something major that we can point to, or is this?
Well, as I say, the two major ones in the Torah are in Tanakh are the Moshe Rabbeinu sending the 12 spies, and then Yehoshua sending 2 spies in Jericho. Those are the two major stories. I'm not aware of it later. I think this is literally the last story where Meraglim are mentioned very, very explicitly. Now, so it really turns out that the message and the musar of the Meraglim is to have confidence that if Hashem has given us a task, we will be able to accomplish it. That Hashem told us, I'm giving you a land, and I'm giving you the wherewithal to conquer it, to build it, to sustain it. And for you to be afraid is really a betrayal not only of your faith in God, but also your faith in yourself. A person has to know that if Hashem gives you a mission, He's giving you the ability to carry through with that mission. And that is why, when you compare the story in Yoshua, you have a very different story. This is 40 years later. The old generation is dead. Yoshua has already crossed the Yarden River with all of the Jewish people. The very first city that Hashem has chosen for conquest is the city of Jericho. And Yoshua sends 2 spies to check out Jericho. Now, the parak in Yeshua doesn't tell you who these 2 spies are, but the Medrash actually gives us names, amazingly enough. They were Kalev, Yeshua's colleague from 40 years before, and they were Pinchas, the Kohen Gadol. Very, very fascinating. Kalev is not a young man. Kalev was 40 years old at the time of the first mission of the Meraglim. This is 40 years later. Kalev is an 80-year-old man.
Senior spies.
That's correct. Now, it could very well be that maybe senior spies are a good thing to do because nobody suspects some 80-year-old gentleman is engaged in a spy mission. Although I knew, of course he was retired already, but I knew a very, very nice balabas in my show who actually made Aliyah in his 90s, and very quiet, modest. He had been a CIA operative. But he never, I don't know, I mean, he never talked about it and, wouldn't answer any questions about it. But you never know behind the quiet exterior, you never know what's actually going on. But okay. And Yeshua and Kalev seek refuge in the house of a woman.
Pinchas and Kalev.
Pinchas and Kalev. Pinchas and Kalev. And they seek refuge in the house of Rochav, Hazona. Rachav Hazona. The word zona, it's interesting, actually means prostitute. She was a prostitute. Targum Yonasan tries to take it down a little bit by saying zona simply means a seller of food. Mocheres zona.
Teaching Beishakov.
Right. So he doesn't want to call her a prostitute, and yet it's very, very clear from the Gemara itself that Rachav was a prostitute. It says she had practiced her trade for more than 40 years. She was also a senior citizen prostitute. And it mentions that her beauty was so renowned that if anyone would even mention her name, they would become aroused and the like, just by just mentioning her name and thinking of her and the like. So she was a prostitute for many, many years, and her house was situated in the wall. This is actually very similar to Mea Sharim. Mea Sharim was originally, there's still remnants of it, but it really was a walled section, a walled neighborhood on all four sides outside of the old city. Eventually they opened up most of the sides, but on Rechov Mea Sharim, that continuous building is the wall. So there are people who had their houses literally in the thickness of the wall, and that is Rachav. Allegorically, some Meforshim want to say that her house in the wall indicates she's part of the Canaanite culture, but her neshama is also outside of that culture. You're on the wall, you're straddling the fence. Part in, part out. That's exactly, what she was. And she gave shelter to these Meraglim, and she gave them a report. A prostitute is actually a very good source of information because she had all sorts of nobility and etc., political officials who were with her. So they got a very good report, and she gave them a report that is exactly the opposite of the way the Meraglim reported things 40 years before. She said, the people are so frightened of the Jews, their hearts have melted. They know they will not be able to withstand. You have courage and success in everything. And she protected them when people were coming to look for them, and she then gave them a way of escape. And the only thing she asked for was that when they destroy Jericho, they will spare her family. And the sign was, let the rope by which we were let down, let it hang outside of your house, and we will know that is a safe house, that we will not attack. According to rabbinic tradition, Rachav converted to Judaism eventually, and according to at least one view, she actually married Yehoshua. She became Yehoshua's wife.
Only wife? Or
I don't know. I don't know if we know. But his children came from Rachav. His children came from this wife, which is interesting because Yehoshua is also 80 years old. So it's interesting that he didn't get married before then. Kalev, by the way, also had an interesting wife. According to Chazal, Kalev's first wife was Miriam. Now Miriam died in the desert. Kalev married Miriam. Now that's interesting because Miriam was much, much older than Kalev. Miriam was, well, let me put it this way. Miriam was older than Moshe. Moshe died at 120. Miriam died only a few months before Moshe. So Miriam was 126. Kalev at that time was 80. So Kalev married somebody that was 40 years older. And Kalev's second wife in Eretz Yisrael was none other than Bitya, or Batya. Bitya is actually the correct pronunciation. Bitya Bas Paro, who was older than even Moshe Rabbeinu, older than Miriam. That is, Bitya Bas Paro was Paro's daughter that rescued Moshe from the Nile and raised him as a baby. And she was Zocha, as an extraordinarily old woman, to come to Eretz Yisrael. And she was the second wife of Kalev. So some of these marriages are very, very interesting. But Yehoshua married Rachav Hazayna, and again, she was able to inspire confidence in her report, unlike the Meraglim that created terror and fear and insecurity. Insecurity is an awful thing. The old idea, Franklin Roosevelt said, the only thing to fear is fear itself. It really is like a fire, meaning people might be confident and ready to take on a challenge. And if there's just one negative thought in the room, that kind of spreads and grows and can take away a person's enthusiasm and can take away a person's confidence. So one has to be very, very careful.
I'm sure he's not the only one, but Viktor Frankl
Yes.
writes about how, and he gives the term, I don't know what the term is, I forgot. Logotherapy, I'm not sure, where people will
Well,
help
logotherapy
you
is
to
his, yeah.
do certain things, speak, perform, in different respects, because they think they can, and never they won't be able to.
Yes.
They're not the only
Yes.
ones of that.
Yes.
Certainly
In
wrote
fact,
about that.
there was interesting, I just read an article, I know nothing about this subject, but apparently there was a very, very phenomenal baseball pitcher who just one day, in the middle of a game, he just felt like a panic and he couldn't do it anymore. And he totally lost his confidence. He had to leave baseball because that one day that he couldn't do it took away his belief that he was capable of doing it. And on one hand, he knows that's crazy. He knows physically he has all of the abilities that he had, but he was so debilitated by that sense that he couldn't do it, that he couldn't do it. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, the old saying that mothers always tell their kids, anything worth doing is worth doing well. So, Rav Weinbach, the Shiva of Orsmech, the Chrono of is not alive anymore. He said he would say it a different way. He would say, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. That's actually profound if you think about it. Because very, very often, we are inhibited from doing something because we are afraid we're not going to do it perfectly. And we're going to be embarrassed. And as a result, we never expand our horizons beyond our comfort zone. Because we think if it's not going to be perfect and I make a mistake, people are going to laugh at me or I'll have a sense of my failure. So Rav Weinbach made the opposite point, that if something is truly a good thing to do, it's worthwhile to try it, even if you're not going to do it so great. Because that way you build up confidence, and after all, if you did something part way, it's better than not doing it at all. And therefore anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Don't be inhibited because it's not going to be perfect. And Voltaire said, the enemy of the better is the best. That when I have this mentality, I have to be the best, and I never become better because I'm so afraid of not being able to do a perfect job. All right, so these are at least peripherally some of the lessons of the Meraglim, of having confidence in your ability to do the mission. And B'ezras Hashem, we should realize that, number one, obviously, living in Eretz Israel is full of challenges. And sometimes we, both us as individuals and collectively as a society, don't always know how to navigate through this and whether we'll be able to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. But we have to know that if Hashem gave us this mitzvah and gave us this opportunity, He will give us the ability to accomplish what we need to accomplish. B'ezras Hashem, we should be zocheh to be able to do that.
May.
Be it by